Organizational culture is not some amorphous blob or mysterious fog that permeates a team or an organization. It's shaped by the actions that leaders choose to make or not to make. Hey leader, David Burkus here, organizational psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. And in this episode, we're gonna talk about the ways in which leaders help their teams and help the whole organization do their best work ever through culture. Since Edgar Schein published his seminal work on organizational culture, seminal series of works really on organizational culture, we have been emphasizing that as leaders and as human resource officers, everyone who is in charge of attracting and retaining people. We've been talking about the importance of culture and usually how great our organizational culture is. But when you dive into it, there's still a lot of misunderstandings about how culture is shaped. Culture is not the fact that you have a foosball table. Culture is not the fact that you have free food on Wednesdays or you let people wear Hawaiian shirts on Fridays. Real Office Space reference, by the way, if you can catch it. Culture, as Edgar Schein pointed out in the book that I guess many people never finished reading, culture is shaped deliberately by 6 actions that leaders make. And so in this episode, we're gonna talk about the 6 ways that leaders shape organizational culture. The first way that leaders shape organizational culture is who they hire, who they bring into the organization, who they let be a member. What are we looking for in a new hire? Are we looking people with just a track record of success and we actually don't care about how they got that success? Or are we looking for people who believe that teams are greater than talent, that being a team player matters more than making your numbers on a quarterly or on an annual basis? Are we looking for people who want to be star performers, or are we looking for people who want to join a great team? It's perfectly reasonable why looking for the latter, looking for people who want to join a great team, would make for a great organizational culture. While there may not be policies at your organization company-wide about who you're hiring, think about how this affects even just the team you lead. If you get a say in the hiring decision, and ideally you should be turning that say over to multiple people on your team or the entire team, who are you looking for? People that'll just make numbers and make it better, or people that truly do want to join a great team? That'll have an effect, maybe not on the entire organizational culture, but on your team's culture. The next way that leaders shape organizational culture is in what they measure. What metrics are we paying attention to? Every organization is paying attention to some set of numbers. Some organizations are paying attention to sort of just one number. What are those numbers and what's behind them? Is it just about profitability? Well, then you may be developing a culture that is willing to win at all costs and actually has a very cutthroat nature to it, a sink or swim nature to it, and a nature that's not really respected in the industry. Is your organization just based on efficiency? Is it based on cost cutting? Well, then you may find that you have a culture that doesn't lend itself to all that much innovation because innovation requires wasting some amount of money. Are you paying attention to turnover numbers to see how quickly people are quitting? That's a huge indication that something might be wrong in your experience. What numbers are the leaders paying attention to? And obviously the numbers that senior leaders are paying attention to are gonna have a bigger effect. But what numbers are you paying attention to on your team? Are you just paying attention to the numbers that result in your bonus? Or are you paying attention to the deeper, richer numbers that might be indicative of whether or not you've got a deep, rich, positive culture on your team? The third way that leaders shape organizational culture is how they react. When a crisis happens, when bad news gets delivered, how do they react? Are leaders constantly having these knee-jerk reactions, whatever the flavor of the moment is? Are they constantly deciding that they want to jump in on that? Or do they have a more long game mentality to what we're doing and what we're about? When bad news happens, are leaders shifting the blame? Are they trying to find someone that other than them that's going to take responsibility and maybe be, invited to shape a culture of a different organization, if you catch my drift? Or are they taking responsibility for it? We made these assumptions, the environment turned out to be wrong, and here's how we're changing. Well, obviously that's going to roll downhill, not just because bad leaders seek to roll blame down the hill. Obviously that culture is going to roll down the hill through the entire organization. How leaders react trains people on how they should react to those same situations, and you may end up with people, even at all levels of the organization, that are trying to shift blame, or people at all levels of the organization that are just reacting to the flavor of the month, the idea of the month, and not making any long productive gains. Leaders have a massive effect in teaching people how to respond to circumstances by the way they respond to circumstances. Now, the fourth way that leaders shape organizational culture is what they fund. What do they make room in the budget for? This happens at a couple different levels. Do you make room in the budget for innovation? We already talked about this in the metrics. Or are you just focused on efficiency and cost cutting and harvesting the most amount of profit from existing products or services? Or are you willing to fund moonshots, crazy ideas, things that might not actually turn into any solid program, product, or initiative, but things through which we will learn? What they fund also means, are we funding things like employee development programs, professional development programs? Are we allocating a certain amount of our funds to help our people get better? Or are we expecting people to already come in with the skills that we want, and we only actually care about whether or not they are able to perform? There are organizations that take a stance on what they fund across this entire spectrum, and they create very different company cultures. I obviously have my preferences. I think one of the things we should be funding is people. I also think one of the things we should be willing to waste money on is innovation, but there are other organizations that are not. And what decisions you make as a leader have a massive effect on that. A side note here, if you're a new leader in an organization, what changes you choose to make in funding may be accepted or rejected by a culture that may not be change ready. So that just again underscores the importance of what they fund as a cultural driver. The fifth way that leaders shape organizational culture is how they act. And I probably should have put this one before how they react, but there's a different set of actions here. How they react is what happens to things that are outside of your control. How they act is about the things you can control. Are you acting with civility? Are you acting with trust and respect for your people? Because people are watching you in a leadership role and deciding how they should act as well. The researcher Christine Porath, for example, found that the number one explanation given by employees for uncivil behavior at work is uncivil behavior by leaders. Leaders model the way. Leaders at all levels model the way. And so certainly how a senior leader acts is going to have a profound effect on how people down in the rest of the organizational chart act. But how you act as a leader of your team is going to train the people on your team about how they should act with each other in team meetings, in collaborating with each other, etc. So it's impactful how leaders at all levels act. And no leader is off the hook in how they choose to make these deliberate actions. The sixth and final way that leaders shape organizational culture is what they reward. Who gets promoted? What gets bonused? What gets praised? It's an old maxim, right? But if you want more of something, praise it and you will get more of it, right? Bonus it in addition to the praise and you'll get even more. While people are weird and they sometimes act irrationally, when it comes to figuring out how to make more money, people are largely rational. And they will pay attention to what's getting rewarded, who's getting promoted, who's getting bonused, and see those people as people they should emulate. And in some ways, this goes all the way back to number 2 and what gets measured, because you get to choose the metrics senior leaders are paying attention to and the way that you reward those metrics. And if you're only rewarding top-down production-related or profitability-related metrics, it should come as no surprise that you end up with a culture where people want to win at all costs. By contrast, if you're measuring and then rewarding a broader set of criteria, then you shouldn't be surprised that your culture grows into that broader set of criteria. Hopefully, it's the criteria of an organizational culture that you actually wanted. Now, I've hinted at it multiple times in this video, but this is not just a video about how senior leaders act and the way that it creates a positive or a negative culture. Although I'll admit it, as you're watching it, you could probably think of both a positive and a negative example for all 6 of these actions. The truth is, people are watching leaders at all levels. And so how you act as a leader of your team, or even just an influential member of your team, is going to have an effect on the culture of that team. And one of the things I've learned more so in the last 2 years than ever before is that most people's experience of work, most people's experience of organizational culture is more affected by the team that they work with than by the broader set of organizational norms or core values or cultures, etc. So if you have people in your charge, if you've got people on your team, and even if you just have influence on the team that you serve on, the burden of responsibility of these 6 behaviors, these 6 actions is on you. The way you act will shape that team culture, and the way that team culture is shaped will determine whether or not people want to stay, who wants to join the culture, and whether or not it's a team where people can do their best work ever. Oh, and one more thing. Speaking of a team culture where everyone can do their best work ever, now that you know how you should be acting to shape culture, don't you want to know what kind of culture you should be shaping? Well, if that's true, you're going to want to check out this video here on what makes for a strong team culture. That one. Watch it with your team.